drop the blue paint in wet, as you can see I'm doing here, starting at the top. Keep loading your brush as well. Don't let the brush run out of paint. You'll get some really lovely, clean, transparent washes that way. And I'm actually painting around the tree, using the tip of my brush to kind of cut in where the branches are as well. So keep it really simple, and remember, keep loading that brush with paint and work your way down to the horizon line. What I'm doing now is I'm mixing up a little bit of cadmium red in with the ultramarine to make a sort of a shadow colour. I'm painting this wet on dry for some shadows in the snow using my size 10 round brush, trying to vary those marks as well, and try to paint them just once if you can. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to sprinkle some sea salt on to the damp sky and try to really spread it out evenly. I'm going to allow that to dry naturally, and what happens is the salt absorbs the paint to create some lovely light textures, as you can see there. I'm going to use a bokeh technique here. So I've got a circle stencil and I'm lifting out with a clean damp sponge the paint, and you get these lovely circles, and it creates that amazing effect that you have with photography. And you can vary the size of your circles as well, and it gives that lovely Christmassy look. So I'm just mixing up this dark green with Prussian blue and a touch of yellow. I'm taking the excess paint as well off on a paper towel, and this gives me a little bit more control. So I'm starting at the top and I'm just tapping very gently the top part of the tree, painting wet on dry. You might want to swap to a smaller brush to paint the very top of the tree. I'm just working my way down, tapping. If too much paint comes out, just tap your brush on the paper towel just to take off that excess paint, and just work your way down to the bottom. And what I've done there is I've just mixed up some darker paint, added some Paynes grey to that Prussian blue with a touch of yellow, and I'm just painting damp into damp this dark paint to create some shadows underneath the foliage here and there. And I've just swapped to a smaller brush now, and I'm just painting the top of the tree, using smaller brush marks and adding a little bit more detail to finish off this stage. And I'm going to allow my painting to dry once more. What I'm going to do now is I'm using white gouache, and I'm using the hog hair brush again, and I'm stippling the white paint wet on dry. If you don't have gouache, don't worry, you can use white watercolour or even white acrylic. And I'm just tapping on the top of the foliage there, and to create the look of snow, and it makes it look a little bit more Christmassy or wintry as well. I've added a little bit of water to the gouache, and I'm going to finish off with a spatter, and I'm using my size 10 round brush to paint the sky with the cerulean blue wet into wet. So it's quite a stronger colour at the top, and you can add a little bit more water to the cerulean to make it paler as it goes down towards the horizon. And I'm painting a little bit of cerulean in the distant snow here, and I'm adding a little bit of that red and burnt sienna to the cerulean to add a little bit of shadow, damp into damp. I'm using the orange mix now and painting this damp into damp on the left here for some of the bushes and the twigs that you can see in the photograph. What I love is all these warm colours in this wintry scene. So I'm actually adding now a little bit of the burnt sienna, and I'm just painting this at the top, and this is for the sort of distant tree foliage, winter foliage there. But again, it's a lovely warm colour against that cool cerulean sky. Loading my brush again and just sort of painting this now into that orange wash, damp into damp, coming over to the right hand side, sort of showing the distant trees on the right. And I'm actually going to use a little bit now of that red and burnt sienna and paint that damp into damp on top of the orange to create some more details and textures. What damp into damp does, it gives you a little bit more definition, but you still have the soft edges. I'm going into the burnt umber now, painting this damp into damp. And if you're concerned about your brush being too wet, just take the excess paint off on a paper towel. So I'm just painting a little bit more of that burnt umber here, damp into damp, tapping in some more details. I'm actually painting in the dark now, and that's the ultramarine mixed with the burnt umber, painting this damp into damp. So you want to make sure that your paper has got a sheen on there. If it has gone, just wait for your painting to dry and then wet it very carefully and gently with clean water. Wait for the water to soak in the paper a little bit and then paint damp into damp. You won't get the colour mixing as much, but you will get the soft edges and blending. I'm using my paper towel to lift off some of that paint that crept down onto the distant snow there. What I'm doing now is I'm using a clean, damp, size 10 round brush, and I'm lifting off the paint now. And this is to represent the birch tree. So I'm going to just work at this, rinsing my brush, taking the excess water off on the paper towel, and then going over that sort of tree trunk shape there, lifting it off in the sky, as you can see there. What you don't want to do is use a very wet brush, so make sure the brush is clean and damp. So take all that excess paint off, and what happens is the brush soaks up that damp paint and lifts it off, and you have a lighter colour underneath. It's not completely white, but it gives a more natural colour for the sort of base of the birch tree there. Now, if you're worried about doing this, you could actually mask out the silver birch tree at the beginning of the painting with masking fluid and allow that to dry. And then once you've finished with your background, etc., you can take off the masking fluid and then paint the silver birch tree. I'm using a plastic card now just to scratch into the damp paint. This is permanent, but it creates some very thin lines to create all those twigs and smaller branches here on the left. You can also lift off with the plastic card as well, which is what I'm doing here, to create the light of the silver birch trees to the left. And it's quite a nice technique. If the paint's too wet, what happens is it all runs back in on itself, and if it's too dry, it won't lift off. So you have to kind of wait for that opportunity, and it's usually when the sheen is still on the paper. So you may want to practice this technique before attempting it. Again, I'm using a clean damp brush, and I'm just lifting off the damp paint here. Even if the paint's dried, you can still do this technique. And I'm using a paper towel to lift off some of the paint as well, doing the same on the other side. And it's just to create these silver birch trees here to the left. They don't have to be as pale as well as the star of the show, the silver birch tree in the foreground. I'm wetting the snow now with my size 10 brush, just with some clean water, and I'm mixing up a dilute orange and just painting this lovely warm colour in the snow, just here and there, leaving some white gaps. And what I'm doing now is mixing up some ultramarine with a pinch of burnt sienna, very dilute, taking the excess paint off on my kitchen towel there and painting some shadows damp into damp in the snow, still leaving white gaps here and there. And I'm going to allow my painting to dry. Once the painting is dry, I'm going to work on the silver birch tree. I've mixed up burnt umber and ultramarine, and I'm painting wet on dry with my size 6 round brush. Those dark characteristic markings that you find on silver birch trees, try to vary them and also vary the colour. So I'm also adding some burnt sienna. Some of those marks are slightly warmer and some are darker. And I'm just working my way down here and there using the tip of my brush and using sort of textured marks, again varying them. And I'm going to mix up now a little bit of that raw sienna. Again, you can use some yellow ochre or even quinacridone gold, and I'm painting these more earthy yellow marks here and there, wet on dry, on the silver birch tree. Going back in now with some Paynes grey mixed in with the burnt umber and really putting some very dark marks, damp into damp, on top of the previous painted marks there, just to really bring out some of those darks and details. And I'm doing the same in the silver birch trees to the left here. Not as many sort of darks because they're a little bit more in the background. So I'm just giving a touch of detail here and there. The reason being, if I give it too much detail, too much attention, it will take away the attention from my silver birch tree, which is the star of my show, the focal point. So I'm just going back to that tree now, adding a touch more detail. I mixed up here some red and burnt sienna, quite a creamy mixture. I'm using my size 8 round brush and I'm painting wet on dry, just lots of twigs and branches and detail here to the left, adding some burnt umber here and painting right at the bottom where it's darkest to really ground it as well. It also creates a really nice contrast against the snow, making it look more like snow. Adding a bit of water here to dilute that dark and blend it up into that orangey sort of wash there. So you've got a graduation of tone from dark, mid and lighter tones. I've just added a little bit more burnt sienna there, blending as I go and adding a touch more of that burnt sienna to the right of the silver birch tree there, using burnt umber now with a touch of the ultramarine and just painting damp into damp right at the bottom there, just to create a little bit more dark and more contrast. And just rinsing my brush there, taking the excess off and just diluting the top part there just to make sure that I haven't lost my light. And I'm mixing up a milky orange here and I am spattering with my size 6 round brush to create some colourful warm textures in the foliage here. And I'm using my plastic card to lift off the damp paint to create some light in this area. And I'm going to allow my painting to dry. I am mixing up some ultramarine with a touch of burnt sienna and I'm painting some shadows wet on dry on the left side of the silver birch tree, so the light is coming from the right. And I'm just doing this very gently so not to disturb that sort of creamy paint that I applied earlier. So gently brushing on that cool shadow colour, and I'm going to use that same colour to paint a cast shadow on the snow from the tree, wet on dry with my size 8 brush. I'm also using this colour just behind here, just blending this cool colour kind of to separate the foreground from the middle ground. I've actually added a little bit of the cadmium red to the ultramarine. I'm painting some of the cool shadows in the snow here and there, not really copying the ones in the photograph. I want to keep it really simple, so the marks behind the tree are smaller and I'll have larger shadows in the sort of foreground to create more depth in the painting and also to lead your eye into the painting with these diagonal lines. And I'm just softening and blending some of the hard edges as well with a clean damp brush. To really ground this silver birch tree, to make it look like it's coming out of the ground, I'm just adding a little bit more sort of details just around the bottom, a few twigs and grasses, using ultramarine, burnt umber and some burnt sienna. Also using my plastic card to pull out some of that paint to create more textures and detail. So I'm using some white gouache here. You can use white watercolour, and if you've lost the light on your silver birch tree, you can add white paint at the end, and that's what I'm doing here. And you can also create texture with it, so you can use a little bit of that dry brush by sort of scrubbing on the white paint. And this is straight from the tube, no water added. And try to keep all that white on the right hand side, but also I'm painting sort of in between the branches there where some of the snow may have settled. A little bit of artistic license, of course. So I'm mixing up some raw sienna here, and I am using my size 4 round brush. I'm just painting in some branches. Now there are a lot of them in the photograph and I don't want to paint that many because I might lose the light of my sky. So again, some artistic license here, just painting in these thin sort of branches, wet on dry. Take your time building up the detail here. You could also use a little bit of burnt umber in the raw sienna just to darken up some of the branches there as well. And what I'm going to do now is mix up some burnt umber here, and I'm going to spatter just around the branches there to create some texture and details there to to finish off that area. I couldn't resist painting some small bouquet circles on the painting to the left here. So I'm just using a small brush and just painting some very small circles. And what I'm doing now is I'm using my size 10 brush and I am spattering the center painting here to make it look like it's snowing. You don't have to do this. I always love to spatter though. It stops me from overworking. And do make sure you cover your other painting. I'm using my hand, but you may want to use a paper towel or a cloth. And it's fun to do, and it really does bring the painting to life, gives it a little bit of sparkle. Sometimes when you've lost your light or you've made a mistake and you want to disguise it, a bit of spattering always seems to do the trick. So my final painting, Sheep in a Blizzard, as you've noticed, I've actually simplified the photograph and used lots of artistic license. It's a fun one to do. I've just drawn a horizon line there, and I'm just literally drawing soft rectangles for the sheep and just sort of little sticks for the legs. Keep it really simple. For the larger sheep in the foreground, I'm just sloping that rectangle shape and then just painting a really simple shape for the face. Try not to worry about the detail. It's just creating the illusion of a sheep. So I'm wetting all of the background right down to the horizon line and painting around the sheep with my flat 1-inch brush, just with some clean water. And then I'm painting the grass area around the sheep, being careful not to touch the sheep with any water. Don't worry about the legs. I'm using the same colours as the previous tutorial, Ultramarine and Burnt Umber. Make sure you mix plenty of paint, large brush, and paint that background. Don't worry too much about backgrounds or anything like this. This is fun. I've added a little bit more burnt sienna there and just painting that warmer colour in there, wet into wet. Going down carefully around the sheep now, varying those colours, a little bit more brown, maybe a little bit more blue, dropping it in there, painting around the sheep there just on the horizon. So I'm going a bit slower now and just adding a touch more dark there, damp to damp, just to make sure I've got some really strong colours in that background, and painting carefully around the sheep. I deliberately used that darker colour so I could have a contrast to the light of the sheep against the dark of the background to bring them out. Don't worry about the legs, as I said, even the head, because you can paint the head a darker colour later, wet on dry. I'm just using the tip of my brush now just to carefully paint down to that horizon, and now I'm sprinkling some sea salt onto the damp paint, and I'm going to allow that to dry naturally. Meanwhile, I'm actually using my plastic store card. I'm scratching into the surface of the paper, and remember this is permanent, but you get these lovely dark thin lines there. It's quite a nice way of sort of giving the illusion of sort of distant trees there. What I'm doing here is I'm creating bigger sort of scratch marks. So I'm using sort of the curved corner edge of the card there to give the illusion of tree trunks, so they're slightly wider. If you find that tricky, you could actually put sort of 2 marks side by side to make it slightly wider to give that illusion of tree trunks in the distance. So I'm going to leave that now to dry off naturally, and I've mixed up here some ultramarine with some quinacridone gold, sort of about 50-50 of each colour. And I'm painting this wet on wet. Don't worry if your painting has dried at the bottom, you could re-wet it again, or you could paint wet on dry, whatever you find easiest there. But I'm painting very carefully around these sheep. Keep loading your brush as well every time you sort of paint a fresh patch, and try not to paint the same place twice. It just keeps the watercolours looking really fresh and vibrant and more transparent. So I'm just sort of carefully painting just underneath the sheep there, just filling in all the white patches there carefully around those sheep. And I've also sprinkled some sea salt onto the damp grass, and I'm using my plastic card again to scratch into the damp surface to create some detailed grasses. I'm using some raw sienna here and I'm painting wet on dry just at the bottom of the sheep there, and then I'll use my clean damp brush to dilute that and blend to the top of the sheep so that the actual top of the sheep always remains white. I'm going to allow my painting to dry naturally. Once it's dry, I'm going to brush off all of the salt with my paper towel. And what I'm doing now is I'm going to paint some shadow colour using the ultramarine and burnt sienna. I'm painting wet on dry again at the bottom and again diluting with a clean damp brush to blend that to the middle of the sheep where it gets paler, and by the time you get to the top it's the white of the sheep. And if you lose your light there, just lift off with a paper towel. So I'm painting the legs here. Remember, keep it really simple. So they're slightly wider at the top and then they get thinner at the bottom. And I'm actually going to paint some shadow underneath to really ground those sheep as well. So I'm using a mixture of the burnt umber with the ultramarine. Here's a close-up. So I'm painting the face, again keeping it really simple. It's like a soft sort of triangle shape. Just added a bit more dark there. You could use Paynes grey if you want to, and dropping some of that dark in the legs at the top part, damp into damp. I'm going to paint the head of the sheep here to the right, keeping it really simple, and then paint the legs in really simple, just little marks there, wet on dry, and just getting slightly pointier as it goes towards the grass. And as you can see, I've idealized these sheep. I've taken the photograph and I have changed it. I pushed them closer together just to make a nice little gathering of three. So I want to explain this process again. I'm painting the mixture of ultramarine and burnt sienna wet on dry at the bottom of the sheep, rinsing my brush, taking the excess water off on the paper towel, and then blending that mark up into the middle of the sheep there. Blending, so I want to keep the top part white. I'm doing the same with the sheep on the left here, again blending with my clean damp brush, just painting in, sort of sharpening up some of the legs there, and I'm going to paint a little bit of dark on the head there and some shadow now using that ultramarine and burnt sienna wash wet on dry just underneath their feet there, and it really does ground them, makes them look like they're standing on the ground. So I'm going to allow my painting to dry, and to finish off this little painting I'm going to spatter again with white paint. This time it really does make them look like they're in the blizzard. That salt looks lovely and frosty, and you can spatter as much as you like. You don't have to spatter at all, of course, but I'm really going for it this time. I'm really giving my brush a good tap right in the middle of the brush, loading that brush with plenty of paint, and to make sure it looks very white and opaque, don't add too much water to the paint. So I think I'll leave it there for now. I'm just removing the washi tape to reveal a lovely white border. It really does present the work well. I'm removing it from the block as well, and here are the three finished paintings. I'm really pleased with them, but I felt the fir tree here to the left need a little bit more work, something to make it pop out a bit more, and I thought it'd be really nice to add a red cardinal bird here to make it look really Christmassy, and the red really does pop in a painting. So I'm just drawing in a very simple shape here, and almost like a shape of an egg, and then a kind of a little pointy bit at the top there, and just now painting it wet on dry with my size 4 brush with some cadmium red and the long sort of tail there as well. Keeping it really simple, just painting the top of his head now, coming to a point, and now I'm using a little bit of cadmium yellow here, painting wet on dry, and a little bit of dark to frame the face using some Paynes grey, quite creamy so it doesn't bleed onto the cadmium yellow. If you're worried about that, do allow the face to dry. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments section, and if you'd like to get access to my exclusive weekly tutorials, why not think about joining my Patreon membership. Details about the membership can be found in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.